In the winter of 1886, as a killing blizzard closed in, Shepherd Stephen read the sky and herded his 200 sheep into a canyon. He slept at the center of the flock. Villagers thought it was suicide. But when the storm cleared, he walked out with every sheep alive and 31 lambs born in the snow, the only herd that grew during the disaster. What did Stephen know that no one else did? Stephen was a solitary shepherd in the Dakota Badlands, a man who spent more time reading the sky than speaking to people. The winter of 1886 had been unusually mild, until it was. A superstorm was building over the northern plains, one that old-timers would later call the Great Die-Up. Most ranchers saw nothing but a cold snap coming. Stephen saw a slaughter. He had studied the patterns that others ignored. The sudden drop in barometric pressure, the way the wind circled back on itself, the nervous bleating of his flock before a single cloud appeared. If he was right, every exposed animal in the county would be dead within days. And if he was wrong, his neighbors would say he'd lost his mind. But Stephen wasn't waiting for anyone's permission. The day Stephen made his choice, the sky was not yet dangerous. It was the 2nd of January, 1886, and across the Dakota Badlands the air felt almost gentle. Meltwater dripped from the eaves of his small sod-roofed cabin, and his sheep drifted across the brown winter grass without urgency. But Stephen barely noticed the warmth. He was watching the high cirrus clouds that had appeared just after dawn, long white streaks pointing southeast like a finger. He had seen that pattern exactly twice before, both times in the mountains of his youth, and both times a killing storm had followed within 3 days. He checked his barometer, a brass instrument his father had carried across the Atlantic, and the needle had fallen further than he had ever recorded. Not a cold snap, a system so violent that the old shepherds called it a white death. Stephen understood whether the way a physician reads a pulse. He had spent 30 of his 43 years living among animals and open sky, and he had learned that sheep could sense atmospheric changes hours before any man. That morning, the flock was restless without cause. The ewes kept lifting their heads from the grass and turning toward the northern ridge, as if they could already see the storm heaving itself together beyond the horizon. Even his border collie, Moss, whimpered at his side and refused to settle. Something was coming. And Stephen knew that if he did not act within hours, every animal in his care would be frozen stiff by the end of the week. But knowing a storm was coming was one thing. Convincing the townspeople of Medora to prepare for it was another. Stephen was not a rancher, not a landowner. He was a hired shepherd, a man who lived on the fringe of the community, speaking only when necessary. The cattle barons who dominated the little Missouri River Valley regarded him as an oddity, a man who preferred the company of sheep to men, who spent his evenings staring at the sky instead of drinking whiskey at the depot saloon. So when he rode into town that afternoon and stood in the doorway of the general store, his warning was met with laughter. Old Tom Havorson, who ran the biggest beef operation in the county, clapped him on the shoulder and said, "Stephen, the sun, been shining for 2 weeks. You've been alone with those woolly beasts too long." Stephen said nothing for a moment. He simply looked at Havorson and said, "The barometer is falling faster than it did in the spring of '71. Remember that year?" The smile faded from Havorson's face. He remembered. They had lost half the cattle in the territory that spring, but he shook his head. "That was spring. This is January. The worst is behind us." Stephen didn't argue. He had learned long ago that men who argued from pride never listened to reason. He turned and walked out, past the shelves of canned goods and the new barbed wire coils, and rode back toward the canyon he had chosen. That canyon was a narrow, box-shaped draw carved into the side of Bullion Butte, 3 miles from his cabin. Its walls rose 60 feet on 3 sides, and the entrance was barely wide enough for a wagon. Stephen had discovered it years earlier while tracking a wounded ewe, and he had noted then how on the coldest nights the air inside stayed calm while the plains around it roared with wind. The overhanging ledges trapped heat rising from the earth, and the tight walls broke the strongest currents into harmless eddies. But no other herder had ever used it as a winter shelter because driving 200 sheep into a dead-end canyon seemed like madness. If the entrance drifted shut, there would be no escape. It was, in the eyes of every practical stockman, a tomb. That, Stephen realized, was exactly why it might save them. He spent the next 2 days preparing. The first task was moving supplies: 2 weeks of hardtack and dried mutton, his medical kit, the birthing ropes and iodine he kept for lambing season, and a heavy canvas tent that he would stretch across the widest part of the canyon to create a secondary roof. But the real work was the sheep. 200 animals did not simply follow a man into a narrow crack in the earth. They would scatter at the first sign of a predator, and the cougars of the Badlands were already growing hungry in the deepening cold. So Stephen used the flock's own instincts. He took the laid ewe, an old black-faced Suffolk he called Queen, and he led her into the canyon with a bucket of grain, while moss circled the edges of the herd to keep strays from breaking away. The ewes followed Queen. The rams, suspicious and stubborn, resisted for an hour, pawing the ground and retreating. But Stephen had placed a length of rope across the canyon entrance, and when the wind shifted again, a sudden cold gust from the northwest, the rams finally came, driven more by animal intuition than by the shepherd's urging. By nightfall on January 3rd, the flock was inside. But the real test was what happened the next morning, when word of Stephen's actions reached the Medora settlement. A pair of cowboys from the Hash Knife outfit had seen the sheep disappearing into the butte. They rode into town and told everyone that the shepherd had gone mad, that he had driven his entire flock into a dead-end canyon on the eve of a supposed storm. "He's going to bury them alive," one of them said. Havorson, now nursing his pride as well as his cattle interests, rode out to the canyon with 3 other men. They arrived just as Stephen was stretching the canvas overhead, tying the ropes to iron pins he had hammered into the rock. Havorson stared at the scene: 200 sheep packed into a narrow space, the entrance partially blocked with driftwood, the man himself kneeling in the dirt, apparently calm. "Stephen," Havorson called, "you can't do this. If the snow fills that entrance, you'll suffocate. You'll lose every animal you've got." Stephen stood up slowly. His hands were raw, his beard flecked with ice. He looked at Havorson not with defiance but with a kind of exhaustion that only men who have spent years being ignored can understand. He said, "I'd rather lose them to a drift I can try to manage than to a 100-mile wind on open ground." Havorson shook his head. "You're gambling your whole livelihood on a hunch." Stephen pointed to a line of low clouds now thickening in the north. "That's not a hunch. That's a freight train. It'll be here by midnight." But Havorson was not entirely wrong about the risk. The canyon's chief danger was not the cold. It was the potential for a sudden thaw followed by a deep freeze that could seal the entrance with a wall of ice. If that happened, Stephen and his flock would be trapped without ventilation. To counter this, he had built a crude windlass from a fallen cottonwood log and rigged a wooden panel that could be lowered over the entrance like a door, but with a gap at the bottom to allow air to flow. He spent the remainder of the day reinforcing that panel and testing the ropes. He dug a shallow pit in the center of the canyon floor for a fire, not a large one, just enough to heat water and provide light, and he lined the edges with stones. Then he brought the sheep closer together, instructing them by the pressure of his body and the calm of his voice to form a dense circle. By twilight, the temperature had fallen 40 degrees. The sheep huddled together, their breath rising in a cloud that filled the canyon with steam. Stephen stood at the entrance and looked out across the plains. The last color had drained from the sky, leaving only a bruised purple that seemed to press downward. In the distance, he could see the lights of Medora flickering. He thought of the families in their warm cabins, trusting their snow fences and their confidence. He thought of the cattle standing out in the open, facing the coming wind with only their hides. Then he turned and walked back into the canyon. He checked the knot on the windless, padded moss on the head, and then did something that no one in the territory would have believed. He lay down in the center of the flock, right in the pocket of warm air rising from 200 living bodies, and he closed his eyes. The first flakes began to fall. The storm hit exactly when Stephen said it would. At 11 o'clock that night, the wind screamed through the Badlands like a beast suddenly unchained, and within an hour the world outside the canyon had vanished into a spinning white void. Inside, the canvas roof snapped and strained, but the walls held the worst of the blast at bay. The temperature, however, plummeted past zero, past 20 below, and Stephen knew that now the flock's own heat would be the only thing standing between them and a frozen death. He walked among them carefully, checking the lambs, rubbing each small body to ensure they were nursing and warm. The ewes pressed closer, and in the dark he could hear their steady, rhythmic breathing. It was then, in the blackness of that first terrible night, that the first ewe began to labor. The lamb was early, brought on perhaps by the stress of the drive or the drop in pressure, and Stephen had to move quickly. He lit his lantern with shaking hands, grabbed the birthing ropes, and knelt in the dirt while the storm raged overhead. He had delivered lambs before, but never in total darkness, never with the wind howling like a judgment. The ewe strained and Stephen worked, and by the small hours of the morning the lamb was alive, shivering and tucked against its mother. Stephen wiped the blood from his hands and looked up. More ewes were restless now. The birthing had not ended. It was only beginning. And somewhere beyond the canyon walls, the storm was just getting started. The die-up had begun. The die-up had begun. Outside the canyon walls, the world was turning into a frozen hell at a pace no one in the Badlands had ever witnessed. The temperature fell through zero, through 20 below, through 30 below, until the air itself became a blade. Cattle caught in the open simply stopped walking. First they bunched together, drifting south with the wind. Then their muscles stiffened, and finally they toppled over, one by one, like dark islands swallowed by the rising white tide. But inside the narrow gash of Bullion Butte, Stephen was not watching the collapse. He was fighting to save the first lamb of the night while 5 more ewes dropped to their knees around him, straining in the dim lantern light. The birth had come fast and hard, and Stephen worked with the quiet precision of a man who had done this in worse places. He pulled the lamb gently, cleared the membrane from its nose, and rubbed it dry with a scrap of cloth until its tiny chest started pumping against his palms. The ewe turned and nuzzled her newborn, and in that moment Stephen saw something that made his heart beat faster. The lamb was not shivering. The lamb, born into the deepest cold the northern plains could manufacture, was already warming against its mother's flank, because the canyon air was not freezing. The flock's collective heat had turned the shelter into a furnace of wool and breath. That was the first pivot, the moment Stephen realized he hadn't just found a hiding place. He had built a living microclimate. 200 sheep packed into 60 feet of rock-walled draw were generating more warmth than a dozen potbelly stoves. Their exhalations rose as steam clung to the canvas overhead and rained back down as a fine, insulating mist. The temperature inside the flock's center, where Stephen knelt with the lamb, hovered just above freezing. Outside, it was 40 below. The difference was the difference between life and a quick, hard death. But the ewes were not finished. By midnight, 7 more lambs had come. Stephen moved among them, lantern swinging, checking each birth with cold, stiffened fingers. He tied off umbilical cords with the sanitized thread he always kept in his vest, poured iodine over the stumps, and made sure every lamb nursed within the first hour. He dozed only in 10-minute stretches, his back against a ewe's warm side while the storm screamed overhead. Moss lay pressed against his legs, the dog's eyes tracking every flicker of movement in the gloom. And beyond the canyon mouth, the drift was building. Stephen had known the entrance would narrow. That was the design. The rough-hewn wooden panel he had rigged to the windlass was holding, but the snow now mounded against it from the outside, packing tighter with every gust. Twice in the black of that first night, he climbed the frozen slope to clear the air gap at the bottom, shoveling with his hands until warm air could flow again. If the vent closed entirely, the flock would suffocate in its own carbon dioxide within hours. He checked the rope on the windlass constantly, knowing that if the panel jammed, he would have to dig upward through a wall of ice with nothing but a knife and his will. Morning never really came. The second day of the blizzard brought only a shift in the darkness from black to a deep, oppressive gray. Stephen could not see the sun. He could not tell time except by the number of lambs that had arrived, 21 by his count, more than he had ever delivered in a single season, let alone a single night. The stress of the drive, the drop in pressure, and the sudden confinement had triggered a synchronized birthing event, as if the flock itself had decided that only new life could balance the scale against so much death. And Stephen, exhausted but clear-eyed, began to understand that something beyond his calculations was unfolding inside the canyon. He had entered with 200 animals. He was now responsible for 221, and the number was climbing. On the open range, the scale of loss was already incomprehensible. The great cattle herds of the Badlands, the Hash Knife, the Custer Trail outfit, the huge spreads that ran 15,000 head were being erased. The animals had started drifting with the wind the moment the storm hit, and without natural shelter they simply kept moving south until the fences stopped them. At the boundary lines, they piled into living ramparts, bellowing into the gale until their voices froze. By the end of the second day, entire pastures had become mortuaries. Cattle stood upright, locked in ice, their eyes open and glassy. Some ranches would later count losses above 90%. Men who had been wealthy at sunrise on January 8th were paupers by sunset on January 10th. And in Medora, the town huddled in its own fear. Nobody spoke of the shepherd. Everyone assumed Stephen was already dead. But Stephen was shoulder-deep in life. By the third day, his hands were raw and bleeding, his coat stiff with afterbirth, but his voice remained calm as he talked the ewes through their contractions. He had learned that the flock's central heat pocket was strongest at night, when the animals pressed close for sleep, so he timed the most difficult deliveries for those hours. He had also learned that the lambs would not wander from the warmth if he placed them carefully among the older ewes, who acted as babysitters while the mothers recovered. The hierarchy of the flock, which he had spent years observing, now served as a nursery structure, and the canyon walls, once feared as a trap, were proving to be the most perfect maternity ward the Badlands had ever seen. But then, on the third night, the sound changed. The steady roar of the wind suddenly dropped in pitch, as if the storm had drawn a deeper breath. Stephen crawled to the entrance panel and pressed his ear against the drift. He could hear a faint, rhythmic thumping, not from outside but from within the snow itself. The weight of the drift was compacting, layer upon layer, and the pressure was starting to warp the wooden panel inward. One of the crossbeams groaned. The windlass rope went taut. Stephen grabbed the handle and cranked, trying to relieve the tension, but the panel barely moved. The storm was trying to seal them inside. He braced the frame with a second timber, then waited. If the panel failed, the drift would pour into the canyon like a frozen avalanche, burying everything in seconds. He sat in the darkness with his hand on the rope, feeling every vibration, and for the first time since the blizzard began, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that Halvorsen had been right, that the canyon was a trap, that he had led his flock into a grave. The thought passed through him cold and quick. Then he looked around at the 26 living lambs, at the ewes breathing in steady rhythm, at Moss watching him with unshakable trust, and he pushed the thought away. He had not come this far to be wrong now. At some point during the fourth day, the drift stopped growing. The wind still howled, but the snow accumulation near the entrance slowed, partly because the outer walls of the butte were now sculpting the current upward, much as Stephen had predicted. The storm was beginning to defeat itself against the landscape. He noticed that the lambs were stronger, nursing with more aggression, and the ewes were producing milk despite the stress. The flock's metabolism, supercharged by the cold, was converting the last of the range grass stored in their bellies into heat and nutrition. And Stephen, who had been rationing his own food, realized that he was not hungry. He was running on something deeper, a certainty that he had tapped into a pattern that no one else could see. Nature was not trying to kill him. Nature was simply being nature. He had only to understand it. On the fifth morning, January 14th, the blizzard finally began to exhale. The wind softened from a scream to a moan, and the pressure against the panel relaxed. Stephen dug upward through the hardened drift at the entrance, cutting steps into the snow with his knife until his head broke through into daylight. The sky was a pale, washed blue, and the air was so cold it burned his lungs, but the world was silent. He pulled himself out and stood on the surface of the drift, which was now level with the top of the canyon walls. He looked north, across what had been the little Missouri River Valley, and saw nothing but smooth, blinding white. No landmarks, no trails, no movement. Then he walked 50 yards across the snow crust and found the first dead steer. It was frozen solid, its hide covered in a glaze of ice, its legs splayed as if it had been struck mid-stride. Behind it lay another, and another. A trail of carcasses led east toward the river, where thousands more were piled against the cutbanks. Stephen stood there, a lone figure in a landscape of absolute ruin, and he understood the full weight of what had happened. The die-up was not a catastrophe. It was a reset. The winter of 86 to 87 had just erased the open-range cattle industry from the northern plains, and down in the canyon, shielded by rock and breath and body heat, his flock was larger now than when the storm began. He turned back toward the entrance, and that was when he saw the figure. A man on horseback, moving slowly across the white expanse from the direction of Medora. The horse was gaunt, the rider slumped. Stephen watched him come, and as the distance closed, he recognized the shape of Tom Havorson. The cattle baron's face was gray with exhaustion, his eyes rimmed red, his coat frozen into stiff folds. He pulled the horse to a stop 20 feet from Stephen and stared down at him without speaking. Then his gaze moved past Stephen toward the canyon mouth, where the steam of the flock rose in a steady column against the cold sky, and where the faint, unmistakable sound of lambs could be heard bleating from the darkness below. Tom Havorson sat motionless on his horse, his breath forming thin clouds that vanished quickly into the frozen air. For a full minute he did not speak. He simply listened to the sounds rising from the canyon mouth, the bleating of lambs, the deep mutter of ewes, and beneath it all the steady pulse of 200 animals breathing together like a single warm-blooded engine. When he finally found his voice, it came out hoarse and cracked. "How many did you lose?" Stephen looked at the canyon entrance, then back at the cattleman. "None," he said. "Not one. And the flock is larger now than when I walked it in." Havorson's face crumpled. He had spent the past 5 days tallying his own dead. The count was already past 4,000 head and climbing. He had ridden out expecting to find a shepherd's frozen corpse. Instead, he had found the only living thing for miles. He slid from the saddle and walked slowly toward the canyon rim, his boots crunching on the snow crust. Stephen watched him peer down into the dim, steam-filled hollow, watched him take in the canvas roof, the windlass, the lambs tucked against their mothers in a ring of wool that pulsed with heat. "You really did it," Havorson whispered. It was not a question. It was an admission. But the story did not end with Havorson's shock. In the days that followed, as the storm fully broke and the plains turned blinding white under a thin winter sun, the scale of the disaster became known. And what Stephen had done was no longer just a curiosity. It became a threat. The Great Die-Up of 1887 destroyed the open-range cattle industry in a single season. Across Dakota Territory, Montana, and Wyoming, the numbers were so staggering that men could not bring themselves to speak them aloud. More than 1 million cattle perished. Entire herds were found frozen solid, still standing in the draws where they had drifted to die. The Hash Knife outfit alone lost 60,000 head. Cowboys who had once been proud frontier laborers were now digging mass graves in the thawing mud of spring. Banks that had lent money on the promise of endless beef collapsed overnight. Fortunes built over 2 decades evaporated before the snow melted. It was, and remains, the worst livestock disaster in American history. And in the middle of that unimaginable carnage, one shepherd had not only kept his flock alive but had actually grown it. When the first rescue teams from Medora reached the Bullion Butte Canyon on January 17th, they found Stephen leading his sheep out single file through a narrow slot he had carved in the drift. Behind him came the ewes, each with a lamb at her side. The final count was staggering. 200 sheep had entered the canyon. 231 emerged. 31 new lambs, born in the belly of the killer blizzard, now toddled on unsteady legs into a world that had just buried millions. The news spread quickly, and with it came a reaction Stephen had not anticipated. It was not celebration. It was fury. Why did the shepherds survive while the cattle barons were ruined? The question gnawed at the men who had lost everything. Some began to whisper that Stephen had made a deal, that no ordinary man could know a storm was coming with such precision, that the heat of the flock was unnatural. Others, more practically minded, turned their anger toward a different target, the sheep themselves. The cattle industry had always viewed sheep as inferior, dirty animals that ruined grazing land. And now, a solitary sheepherder had humiliated the most powerful ranchers in the territory. By February, a group of cattlemen had begun meeting in the back room of the Medora depot to discuss what should be done about Stephen and his growing reputation. Halvorson, to his credit, refused to join them. He had seen the inside of that canyon. He knew there was no witchcraft, only a kind of intelligence that the frontier had failed to value. But his voice was one against many. The danger grew quietly, the way ice forms beneath snow, invisible until it breaks. Stephen was warned by a sympathetic storekeeper that some of the cowboys were planning to run his flock off a cliff, to prove that what the storm couldn't kill, they could. Stephen listened to the warning, thanked the man, and then did something utterly characteristic. He returned to the canyon. Not to hide, but to study. He had noticed during the blizzard that the snow had formed in layers against the canyon walls, and that the deepest warmth had accumulated precisely where the rock overhang reflected the flock's body heat back downward. He mapped the angles, sketched the airflow, and began to understand that he had accidentally built something far more important than a storm shelter. He had built a proof of concept. If a shepherd could turn a dead-end canyon into a maternity ward during the worst winter in memory, then the entire approach to livestock on the northern plains could be rethought, not with wooden fences, but with the land itself. But before he could share that insight, the retaliation came. On the night of February 23rd, 3 men rode out to Stephen's cabin with cans of coal oil and a torch. They intended to burn his hay stores and scatter his flock into the open range, where the remaining winter cold would do the rest. What they did not know was that Stephen had already moved the flock back into the canyon that afternoon. Not out of fear, but because a second storm was building, a smaller one, but still deadly for newborn lambs. When the men arrived at the cabin and found it empty, they set fire to the outbuildings anyway, the flames leaping into the night like a declaration of war. From the canyon 2 miles distant, Stephen saw the orange glow on the horizon and knew exactly what it meant. He did not reach for his rifle. He did not ride into town to accuse anyone. He simply sat in the dark, surrounded by his flock, and calculated his next move. Because Stephen was not fighting men. He was fighting an idea, the idea that strength always mattered more than understanding. And that idea, he was beginning to realize, would not die quietly. The fire changed everything. The next morning, when word spread that Stephen's property had been torched, public sympathy began to shift. Even those who distrusted him could not stomach arson against a man who had just survived the blizzard. Halvorson rode out with 2 other ranchers to offer help, and for the first time, Stephen found himself not alone against the community, but standing with a few allies who were willing to admit that the old ways had failed. Halvorson looked at the smoking ruins of the cabin and said, "I lost almost everything, Stephen, but you didn't cause that. The storm did, and my own stubbornness." He extended his hand. Stephen took it. The handshake did not rebuild the cabin, but it built something else, a fragile bridge between the cattle world and the shepherd's world, 2 systems that had never before found common ground. And then came the revelation that nobody expected. As the spring thaw began in late March and the prairie slowly turned from white to muddy brown, Stephen walked the canyon with a surveyor's chain, measuring temperatures at different depths and distances from the walls. He had noticed something strange during the final days of the blizzard. The lambs that stayed closest to the center of the flock grew faster. Their coats were thicker, their eyes brighter. The old ewes that had been on the periphery near the canvas roof had lost weight. The difference was not just shelter, it was stratification. The flock's body heat had created a thermal gradient, and within that gradient, life had clustered in the precise zone where survival was optimized. Stephen wrote his observations down in a small leather journal, a record that would later be studied by agricultural scientists, though he did not know it at the time. He wrote, "The center is not just warm, it is alive. The edge is where the cold wins." That one observation, scrawled in the dim lantern light of the canyon, would reshape how generations of herders manage their animals in extreme environments. The shepherd's insight was no longer just a survival story. It was becoming a body of knowledge. But the true magnitude of what Stephen had done did not fully land until the spring roundup, when the cattlemen tallied their final losses. 90% of the open-range herds were gone. The survivors were starving, their hooves worn to bloody stumps from drifting across the frozen plains. The beef industry that had once dominated the territory was effectively extinct. And in the middle of that collapse, Stephen's flock stood out like a living rebuke. His sheep were fat, his lambs were thriving, and he had lost nothing, not one animal. In a world where everyone else was counting the dead, Stephen was counting the living, and the living outnumbered what he had started with. The 31 lambs were now scampering across the new grass, and the ewes were already pregnant again. The disaster had not just spared Stephen, it had made him rich. The story was too powerful to stay local. By summer, journalists from as far east as Chicago had ridden into the Badlands to interview the shepherd who had outsmarted the Great Blizzard. They expected to find a mystic. They found a quiet, weather-beaten man who spent more time watching the clouds than talking, and who answered their questions with observations about wind shear and barometric pressure. One reporter wrote, "He speaks of the storm as if it were a chess opponent, one he had played before and understood." The article ran under the headline, "The Shepherd Who Tamed the Winter," and it made Stephen famous in a way he had never sought. Letters arrived from Scotland, from Australia, from Argentina, all from herders who wanted to know how he had done it. Stephen answered some of them, but to most he sent a single sentence: "Listen to the animals and the sky. They will tell you more than any man." But fame was not the final twist. The final twist came when the cattlemen who had once tried to ruin him came to him for advice. By the summer of 1888, with their ranches bankrupt and their grazing land empty, many of them had switched to sheep. The animal they had despised was now their only path back to solvency, and they needed to learn how to keep them alive through the next winter. Stephen did not turn them away. He walked them through his records, showed them the canyon, explained the principles of thermal layering and wind deflection. The same men who had once called him a madman now stood in his makeshift classroom, taking notes. The hatred had not vanished, but it had been forced to make room for something else. The hard, humbling truth that the shepherd had been right all along. And that truth, once it took root, would outlast the storm, the fire, and the cattlemen's pride. The legend of the 31 lambs born in the snow was only the beginning. The real question was what Stephen would build with the knowledge he had earned, and whether the world was finally ready to listen. The world listened, but not at first in the way Stephen might have hoped. The journalists who came to the Badlands in the summer of 1887 were after a miracle story. They wanted the shepherd who had dreamed a prophecy and walked unscathed through the apocalypse. What they found instead was a man who insisted on showing them his barometer. Stephen led the reporters up the muddy trail to Bullion Butte and pointed to the canyon's walls, explaining how the overhang trapped heat. He showed them the windlass he had built, the canvas roof, the stones he had laid for the fire pit, and the drift scars still visible on the outer rock. To a man from the Chicago Inter-Ocean, he said, anyone could have done it if they had watched the sky long enough. The reporter wrote that line down but did not believe it. The article still made him a legend. The headline read, "Stephen the Shepherd, the man who made the blizzard build his fortress." The story was reprinted in papers from St. Louis to San Francisco. In the telling, the barometer became a kind of wizard's wand, and the 31 lambs became a parable. Stephen, who had spent his life avoiding attention, was now the most famous stockman on the northern plains, and he hated every minute of it. Because the fame brought not only curiosity seekers, but also a harder question. If one man could save his animals with nothing but a canyon and a length of rope, why had so many others failed? The answer was as brutal as the winter itself. The cattle industry had been built on a single assumption, that the open range was limitless, and that a strong animal could endure anything. The blizzard of '87 proved that assumption false so completely that the landscape never recovered. In the Little Missouri River Valley alone, the carcasses were so numerous that spring that men could walk for miles stepping from one frozen ribcage to the next without touching ground. The stench, when the thaw finally came, was said to have reached the settlements 2 days before the meltwater did, and the economic collapse that followed was just as thorough. Ranches that had been valued at hundreds of thousands of dollars sold for the price of their unbranded calves. Banks in Bismarck and Miles City padlocked their doors. The cattle barons who had once ruled the territory like feudal lords were reduced to taking loans from the same merchants they had once sneered at. It was not just a die-up. It was an extinction event for an entire way of life. And in that hollowed-out world, Stephen's 31 lambs were not just a curiosity. They were a reproach. They were proof that the disaster had been survivable if only the men in charge had been willing to learn from a different kind of mind. The conversion of the cattlemen was slow and painful, like the setting of a broken bone. Havorson was the first. After the handshake at the burned cabin, he became Stephen's unlikely advocate, appearing at Stockmen's Association meetings and telling anyone who would listen that the future of the range was not in beef but in sheep. He was shouted down at first. Men accused him of betraying the cattleman's code. One old rancher threw a whiskey glass at his head. But as the spring wore on and the banks began calling in their loans, the shouting turned to desperate silence and then to questions. How many sheep could a man run on the same land that had supported 1,000 steers? How much wool could he sell? How did you keep the lambs alive through the spring storms? Stephen, who had never been a teacher, became one by default. He began holding informal gatherings at the canyon entrance, using the steam rising from the flock as his blackboard. He taught the cattlemen about thermal layering, about the importance of windbreak porosity, about the way sheep could be managed as a single living unit instead of a scattered herd. A few of the men took notes. A few walked away shaking their heads. But enough stayed that by the autumn of 1888, more than a dozen new sheep operations had sprung up in the Badlands, each one using some version of Stephen's Canyon principles. The shepherd who had once been an outsider was now, without ever seeking the role, the architect of the region's recovery. The surprising detail that almost no one recorded at the time was the journal. Stephen's leather-bound notebook, the one he had filled by lantern light during the blizzard, contained not just observations but a complete system. He had mapped the thermal gradients inside the canyon with the precision of a man who thought in numbers. He had recorded the exact body temperature of ewes at different distances from the center, the rate at which lambs gained weight relative to their position in the flock, and the wind speed thresholds at which the canvas roof needed additional bracing. He had even sketched a series of diagrams showing how to orient a canyon entrance relative to prevailing winter winds to maximize heat retention. The notebook was, in essence, the world's first scientific manual for extreme weather shepherding. Stephen never published it. He simply kept it in his vest and referred to it when a question was asked. Decades later, in 1903, a young agricultural researcher from the University of Minnesota named Arthur Dinsmore traveled to the Badlands to study the region's sheep operations. He found Stephen, now an old man with a white beard and hands gnarled by frost, still running his flock in the same canyon. Dinsmore spent 3 weeks copying the notebook by hand. The resulting bulletin, Thermal Shelter Designed for Small Ruminants in Cold Climates, became one of the foundational texts of American animal husbandry. Stephen was listed as a co-author, though he had never asked for credit. The notebook is now preserved in the archives of the North Dakota Agricultural College, a small leather volume that saved more animals than any fence ever built. The canyon itself became a landmark. By the turn of the century, it was known locally as Shepherd's Cradle. Herders traveling the Little Missouri country would detour miles out of their way to see it, to stand in the same hollow where the 31 lambs had come into the world while the worst blizzard in memory raged overhead. What struck most visitors was how small the canyon actually was, barely 60 feet across at its widest point, a tight crack in the earth that seemed incapable of sheltering 20 sheep, let alone 200. But that was the point. The size was the secret. A larger space would have allowed the heat to disperse. The tight walls had compressed the flock into a living furnace, and the overhang had bounced the warmth back down like a wool-lined ceiling. Stephen had not chosen the canyon because it was the best option on the map. He had chosen it because he had walked every fold of the Badlands for 30 years and understood the shape of the land as intimately as a sailor understands the shape of the sea. The canyon was not a lucky find. It was the culmination of a lifetime of paying attention. The final accounting of Stephen's blizzard year was recorded in the spring roundup ledgers of 1887, which still exist in the Medora Historical Society. The entry, written in a clerk's careful script, reads, S. Shepherd, 200 ewes entered winter, 200 ewes survived, 31 lambs added. No losses. The only man in the county to finish ahead. That word, ahead, is the crux of the whole story. In a season when the entire northern plains went backward, when fortunes collapsed, when entire species were nearly wiped from the region, when the land itself seemed to turn against human ambition, one man had moved forward, not because he was stronger than the storm, but because he had finally understood something that the frontier had spent 2 centuries ignoring. Nature does not respect effort, it respects alignment. And Stephen had aligned himself so completely with the forces of wind, terrain, and animal instinct that the blizzard, blind and mindless as it was, had been made to work for him instead of against him. That understanding did not die with Stephen. It spread, slowly at first, then all at once, as the sheep industry replaced the cattle industry across the northern plains. By 1910, the Badlands were home to more than 200,000 sheep, most of them managed according to principles that could be traced directly back to that one small canyon on Bullion Butte. The descendants of the 31 blizzard lambs formed the genetic foundation of some of the hardiest wool flocks in the country, their bloodlines prized for cold tolerance and mothering instinct. And the men who had once ridden out to burn Stephen's cabin either left the territory or became shepherds themselves, their grandchildren now telling the story of the Great Blizzard as a family heirloom, a reminder that survival sometimes depends on listening to the person you most want to ignore. Stephen himself lived another 18 years after the storm, dying peacefully in 1905 at the age of 62, on a mild spring morning with his flock grazing within sight of the cabin he had rebuilt. His grave, marked by a simple stone on a bluff overlooking the Little Missouri, bears no epitaph about the blizzard. It says only, he listened. 2 words. They are enough. Because the question that the entire story leaves behind is not whether Stephen was a genius or a prophet or a lucky fool. It is a much simpler question, and a much harder one. In a world that still builds its empires on pride and power, on the assumption that the biggest force must always win, how many storms could be survived if we simply learned to listen before they arrived? The question lingers because the world Stephen faced is not really gone. The blizzard of 1887 was a once-in-a-century event, but the mindset that made it fatal, the belief that bigger herds and stronger fences could always overrun nature, is still with us. Every winter, somewhere on the high plains, a stockman loses animals he could have saved because he trusted in force instead of observation. Every year, communities ignore the warning signs of a gathering storm, not because the signs are invisible, but because the people who read them are too often the ones with the least power to change the plan. Stephen was a shepherd, a man with no money and no influence, yet he moved 200 lives into a crack in the earth and walked out with more than he started. He didn't beat the storm. He joined it, understood it, and let it do the work. The canyon was a classroom, and the lesson it taught was that survival is not a test of strength, but a test of humility. The willingness to admit that nature's signals are louder than human confidence, and that the person who sees the truth first must sometimes act alone while everyone else is still laughing. What makes the story endure is not the miracle of the 31 lambs. It's the quiet years before the blizzard, the decades Stephen spent learning to read a sky that anyone could have studied, but almost no one did. He wasn't blessed with a vision. He was disciplined with attention. That distinction is uncomfortable because it shifts the responsibility onto us. If a solitary shepherd with a brass barometer and a lifetime of looking upward could predict and survive the great die-up, then what could we survive if we paid the same close attention to the systems we depend on now? The storm patterns are shifting again. The old certainties about land and weather are buckling under new pressure. The question is whether we will listen to the Stevens of our time, the people whose knowledge is earned in solitude, who speak quietly, who are easily dismissed before the next whiteout arrives, because the storms are coming. They always do. The only variable is whether we walk into them blind, or whether we, like Stephen, have already read the sky and chosen our ground. If this story stayed with you, if it made you look at survival differently, then you understand why these hidden moments matter. Subscribe now and join us for the next fateful confrontation, where the line between disaster and deliverance is drawn by the choices of a single mind. Until then, keep your eyes open. The sky is already speaking.